Hey everyone, welcome back to Octopi Poker. I am Matt Hunt, and in this video we're going to do a review of a full final table which is coming from this year's Triton Jeju 2 50K No Limit Hold'em event. Now, if you've already checked out our other video where I did a review of a specific hand from this final table, then you'll recognize a couple of the players. You can also check out the hand report for that specific hand where I break down some of the strategy in a bit more detail. But for this video, we're going to review the entire final table of this event. We've got 77 hands here in the Vault archive, as you can see, and we do have sims for all of those hands, so we're going to go through at least the pre-flop on a lot of them, and we're going to dive into as much detail as we can do here for some of these different spots and see how this final table played out. Now, as you can see, we've got the breakdown of the full details of the event here, and it was taken down by Punnat Punsri for a score of just under 1.7 million US dollars. So nice score for Punnat there. Triton title for him to add to his collection. And you can see it was a pretty stacked final table. We got a lot of top quality players right here. And as you see from the payouts, it's clearly very high stakes. So if we want to look at the overall flow of the final table, we can use the stack map, which you see right in the middle right here. And if you look at the map, you can see the stacks of each player as they rise and fall. Now, we started out with Brandon Wilson at the top of the chip counts at the beginning of the final table. If we hover over here, you can see that Brandon is very much at the top of the counts right there. And him and Punnat kind of contest the chip lead between themselves for a big chunk of this final table. You can really see that there's not a lot of movement among the stacks until we get somewhat further in. We've got a lot of short stacks just kind of hanging around there for a big chunk of this final table, up until we get our first elimination in the form of Jean-Noel Torel in 7th place. So I'm now going to take a look at this particular hand where Jean-Noel gets eliminated. So we're going to hit review hand right here. Now, Jean-Noel is known for a fairly unpredictable playing style, so certainly we might see some unconventional stuff from him from time to time here, but he is very shallow in this spot. He's in the big blind and he only has 3.5 big blinds. So not really going to be a ton of scope for him to get super out of line off of that stack size. We do have Clemens Reuter opening under the gun with pocket kings. He's going to min raise into Jean-Noel's big blind. Everybody's going to fold around, and Jean-Noel is just going to go all in for 4.5 big blinds with Queen 9 suited, and of course he's going to lose. Now let's take a quick look at the sim here, because it is interesting to see what exact range Jean-Noel is supposed to go all in with here. On the right over here we have Clemens Reuter's opening range, which is very, very narrow considering how much ICM pressure he's under with the big stacks left to act behind and with Jean-Noel in the big blind. And Jean-Noel there actually has a surprisingly tight strategy here. It's not just because the opening range itself is quite narrow. It's actually just because he does have enough chips left at this point that he has a non-zero amount of equity in the tournament. There is a 10 big blind stack at the table. There's a 19 big blind stack. Clemens himself doesn't have a particularly deep stack. So Jean-Noel does here have some incentive to either just call and try to flop some equity and maybe occasionally get away from it, or just fold. And as you can see, even hands like King 10 off are actually folding here, which is maybe a bit of a surprise given the extremely small stack that Jean-Noel has, but it is noteworthy to see that even in some of these ICM spots, we can get away from some of these hands and live to fight another day, perhaps. So interesting situation. He does get it in with the Queen 9 suited, which in fact is actually losing to get it in here. He's losing about 13K. He is making quite a bit by calling. He's making almost 4K by calling, but getting it in with Queen 9 suited, not actually necessary here. So it seems like it would be better for him to kind of wait for the flop and see what the flop brings. And on this particular flop, maybe he would have gotten away from it. So very interesting spot, but Jean-Noel does bust in 7th place. So now, as you can see, right after Jean-Noel busts, we get a little bit more movement in stacks, couple of fluctuations here, maybe a little bit of a chipping down from the chip leaders, as you can see at this point. And then the next big shift in chips comes at this hand right here, where we can see the player highlighted in purple here, which is Samuel Mullur. He loses a pretty big chunk of chips. Now, you'll be familiar with this hand here if you watched the video that I recently made. And that's because this specific hand is one where Samuel Mullur is going to run that big bluff against Punnat here, and he's going to get called on the river with the Jack 3, and Punnat's going to win a big one. So Samuel is going to be down to about 2 big blinds. So we'll just scan back through this hand again, and as you can see, it plays out as we saw on the other video, and Samuel is now at 2 big blinds. Now the very next hand we don't have in the database because we had a bit of a technical issue with that one, but the hand after this where Samuel actually busts, we can see right here if we look at the review. So Samuel does have pocket 5s in the small blind, and as you can see, Punnat is going to basically just jam the button. Samuel's going to call it off with 3 bigs, and Igor folds, and Samuel busts. Let's take a quick look at this sim. It will be interesting to see how wide Samuel's supposed to call off here. Super wide jamming range for Punnat on the button, which is pretty much what we would expect from the chip leader. And of course, Samuel is calling off a ton of hands here. He's a distant last in chips, although there is actually another short stack here, so it's kind of interesting to see that even with a 6 big blind stack there, he does have such a wide calling off range. But nevertheless, he's calling off tons of hands, and that's just against a very wide shoving range. So he's going to have plenty of equity with pocket 5s. He is making about 34K in EV by calling it off here, but he does lose to the king-queen off. So unfortunately for him, Samuel is now out in 6th place. Now, if we go back to our stack map just along the bottom right here, you can see that there's actually an elimination pretty much back to back. There's another elimination right after Samuel busts out, and it's going to be Manuel Fritz, who is already sitting on a short stack at the point when Samuel busts. And the next hand, he's going to get dealt pocket 9s after the blinds go up. He's going to make it 5 big blinds from a stack of 6 big blinds. So he's going to put almost his entire stack in. And then, of course, Brandon Wilson in the big blind is just going to call, bet 1 big blind, and we're going to be all in. And Brandon does make 2 pair, and we get another elimination for Manuel Fritz right there. So we are now down to 4 players. We've got Clemens Reuter on 11 bigs, Igor Yaroshevsky on 18, and then we've got Brandon Wilson and Punnat with the much bigger stacks right here. Now, as you can see again from the stack map, not a lot of change until we get through to the next elimination. So just a lot of small pots being traded back and forward, a lot of KG battling back and forth from all the players here. And if we look now at this hand where we get a bust out from Clemens in 4th place, we'll see how he gets eliminated. He does have king-queen off in the big blind. We see a shove from the small from Brandon Wilson, and Clemens is just going to call it off. And unfortunately, he does lose this flip against a 6 off. So if we break this one down, we'll probably see that it's a fairly straightforward spot here, given how wide and how aggressively Brandon is going to be able to shove from the small blind. And Clemens clearly has a lot of equity to call off with king-queen off. He's making about 15K by doing so, so completely reasonable call off. And unfortunately, he does just lose to the a6, which is also a completely reasonable shove. So both players doing fine there. Now, this is where the stack map starts to get a bit more complicated, because as you can imagine, with 3 players left, there's a lot of chips changing hands. We do start to see a little bit of a climb down here from Igor Yaroshevsky in 3rd place. And we also see a bit of a divergence in stacks around this point, where Brandon starts to pull away a little bit from Punnat. We see a couple of chips change hands there, and if you look at the progression of the stacks, Brandon goes from 53 to 55, then he goes from 55 to 59, from 59 to 64. So he just wins 3 pots in a row and chips up fairly substantially right there. Then we get Igor winning one, and we start to see Brandon maybe slide down a little bit again here. And at this point, when Igor has now chipped up to over 20 big blinds and Punnat hasn't won a pot for a while, especially with the blinds approaching the new level of 150-300 here, it's interesting that Punnat actually hasn't won a pot for a while and has been kind of basically dropping and dropping ever since this point here, where he had the chip lead at the 100-200K level. But he does get rescued by a couple of pots that he wins at this point. So we see him retake the chip lead here from Brandon after winning a couple of pots back to back from Brandon. And at this stage, in this particular hand right here, we're going to take a closer look at this one, because Brandon goes from 38 bigs down to 25, and Punnat goes from 39 up to about 55. So let's see how this one plays out. Igor folds the button, Brandon limps the small blind, Punnat's going to raise, Brandon calls, it's going to come ace, deuce, 3, check, small bet, call, jack turn, check, check, 10 river, bet, and a call. So a 10 big blind bluff on the river from Brandon and a call. Let's take a look at this one pre-flop. We don't have a post-flop sim for this one. I think both players played it pretty reasonably post-flop, although maybe a little bit surprising not to see Punnat go for some more value on the river there, but probably pretty close. If we look at the full pre-flop sim, we will see that Brandon does a lot of limping here. He is out of position against the chip leader, so we would expect him to be pretty limp heavy here. And 8-4 suited, as you can see over here, is mixing between limps and raises. So he's fine with this specific hand, and he doesn't really have a ton of incentive to be raising a lot. There's just a very narrow raising range there. Once he does limp, Punnat has quite a polarized raising range, which we will see quite a lot from the big blind here. His 10 deuce off is actually a very high frequency raise, so he kind of nailed it there. One of the highest frequency raise combos in that bluff region. And once he does raise, Brandon then actually makes a little bit of a loose call. 8-4 suited, as you can see here, is slightly outside the boundary of what he's supposed to call with. 8-5 is pretty much the bottom here. 8-4 just a little bit too weak. So it is interesting to see that Brandon perhaps a little bit loose in this particular spot. Post-flop, I think the way he played it seemed like it was very reasonable, completely fine. But as you can see, a good chunk of calling here, and actually a pretty protected calling range, because jacks, 10s, king, queen suited, hands like this are actually just calling a lot here. Ace, jack suited, not really able to 3-bet at all here. So lots of ICM pressure on Brandon because of this 12% risk premium against the big blind here. So interesting spot. Brandon does lose some chips, and now Punnat has a much more commanding chip lead. He has 55 bigs or so. Brandon has 23 and Igor has 20. So Punnat very much pulling away now. However, he does pretty much immediately get pulled back, except it's not by Brandon, it's by Igor. We get a big pot between Igor and Punnat a couple of hands later, and as you see, Punnat opens the button with a jam. Igor wakes up with the ace-queen off, and he calls, and we just get an ace-queen victory for Igor, even despite Punnat flopping the ace-deuce for 2-pair. So the 7 on the river counterfeits Punnat's ace-deuce, and Igor does double up. So now Brandon is the clear short stack. And as you can see, a little bit of trading blows from Punnat and Igor here. Not really too much of a change in the overall distribution there once we get to this point. And it's not going to be until we get a third place bust out from Igor that we actually see a substantial deviation in the chip stacks here. So it's going to be at around this point in the event. So we're going to go with review hand. So let's now take a look at this hand where Igor is going to bust out. We have Punnat on the button with the 10-9 suited. He's just going to rip it once again. And again, Igor wakes up with ace-queen off in the small blind. Brandon folds the big, and this time Punnat makes trips and Igor is gone in third place. If we look at the sim, we're going to see that the 10-9 suited here is right in that region that wants to shove the button, so very reasonable from Punnat there. And the ace-queen off is actually surprisingly marginal here from Igor in the small blind. It is okay to call. It's about break even here, losing 500 bucks at equilibrium, but that's going to pretty much even out in the solver if we run it to a more precise degree of accuracy there. So in the end, it's actually a somewhat loose call from Igor there. So the ace-queen off, a little bit on the borderline. Even ace-king off is a little bit on the borderline there. Ace-queen suited, ace-jack suited doing slightly better, which is very interesting. But in the end, I think probably a pretty reasonable call, especially if Punnat is jamming even a little bit wider than what the sim suggests here. So Igor does bust, gets unlucky, and now we have Punnat heads up against Brandon Wilson with a massive chip lead. Now, Brandon is going to survive a few hands here. It's not going to be an immediate bust out by any means, but it won't take too long before we get to that winning hand for Punnat. And let's take a look at it right here. We do have Brandon on the button with pocket kings. He is going to come with a limp. Punnat's going to check. It's going to come jack, 9, deuce. Goes check, check. And then, of course, Punnat binks the 10 on the turn. Brandon's going to call with the kings. Punnat checks. Brandon actually jams for value with kings here, which is a very interesting value jam. I like it. I think it's good. It's thin, but it's completely reasonable, I think. And Punnat does just call with the 2-pair here. So really interesting spot. Very interesting hand for both players. If we looked at the pre-flop sim, you can see right here, pocket kings, very clear limp from Brandon. and 10-9 off is actually a mix for Punnat here, so quite close. But ultimately, completely reasonable, I think, all around from both sides here. And Punnat does take this one down for that big score, like we mentioned at the beginning. So that is our final table breakdown. As I mentioned before, you can check out the specific hand video that I made about the spot between Samuel Mullur and Punnat. That should be linked right up here. And you can also check out the hand report for that situation, for that hand, that details some of the strategies in a bit more depth and can give you guys some real insight into what the sims looked like at each point in that hand. So thank you everybody for joining me, and I'll be back again soon with another final table hand review. Thanks everybody.